This episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast is sponsored in part by Law Enforcement Labor Services in Minnesota.
Law Enforcement Labor Services, also known as LELS, is Minnesota's largest public safety labor union, with over 7,000 Minnesota public safety members serving in all areas of public safety. Law enforcement, 911 dispatch centers, corrections, public safety administrative support personnel, and firefighters. Established in 1977, LELS serves over 260 different public safety agencies and over 450 locals across the state of Minnesota. With their administration, general counsel, 3 staff attorneys, and 14 business agents, LELS provides contract negotiations for better wages and benefits, grievance processing and representation, discipline representation, mediation and arbitration, assistance with representation for post-board hearings, and in-line of duty death benefits for survivor families. Find out more about Law Enforcement Labor Services at LELS.org. LELS.org.
Episodes of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast may contain strong language and violent content. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sheriff Scott Rose from Minnesota, and I'm your host for today's new episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast.
Walking eastbound.
In each episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast, we'll share the details and the stories of how these men and women heroically lost their lives in the line of duty. Our mission is to help ensure their service and sacrifice is never forgotten. Thanks for spending some time with me today to remember and honor these fallen heroes. Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, arranged in his will for his estate to fund the Nobel Peace Prize, which is awarded every year on December 10th, the anniversary of his death. It's awarded to people who have done the most of the best work for fraternity between nations, for the abolition or reduction of standing armies, and for the holding and promotion of peace congresses. George B. Selden was granted the first United States patent for a new invention that would eventually change the way Americans travel forever. The invention was what he called the automobile. The country's first public golf course opens in the Bronx, New York, and it's called Van Cortlandt Golf Course. Fast forward to today, there are around 16,000 golf courses around the U.S., spreading across every state in the country. Now, that's more green grass locations at which to play golf than the total nationwide number of Starbucks or McDonald's stores. The year was 1895. In south-central Minnesota, located in Brown County, is the German settlement called New Ulm. Named after its sister city in southern Germany, New Ulm had been a steadily growing community in this part of Minnesota for 4 decades. This community is known for its strong German heritage, historical sites, and historical landmarks dating back to the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. This war began with the attack of the Lower Sioux Agency, which was only 30 miles up the Minnesota River from New Ulm. Now, the community would come under attack the next day. These townspeople were able to repel the attack and construct barricades around the center of town. A few days later, the Dakota returned with a larger force, and they outnumbered the townsmen, resulting in most of the town outside the barricades being burned to the ground. This left only 49 buildings to house a population of 2,500 people. The majority of citizens would evacuate to a neighboring community called Mankato a couple days later after burying their dead in the New Ulm streets. They would return after the conflict to rebuild. One of the most historic buildings to survive this attack would eventually become one of the oldest and largest breweries in Minnesota. A German immigrant named August Schell started the August Schell Brewing Company in New Ulm just 2 years earlier. At the time, it was only one of 2 family-owned breweries in all of America, and with its strong German heritage, it would quickly become the center for brewing in the upper Midwest. By 1895, the city had grown to over 3,700 citizens. Now, America was in what would be referred to as the Gilded Age, which is the period from the late 1870s to the late 1890s. This period followed the Reconstruction era, or a period in U.S. history that followed the American Civil War, the reintegration of the 11 former Confederate States of America into the United States, and the abolition of slavery. The railroad was the primary mode of long-distance travel back then. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway was located on the southwest side of South Valley Street and 2nd Street South in the city. From New Ulm, citizens could travel east to Mankato, then either north to the Twin Cities or continue east to Rochester, or even through Wisconsin down to Chicago. Locally in New Ulm, the streets were full of horses and horse-drawn carriages. Back in 1895, the 4th of July celebrations would include parades, fireworks, community gatherings, and patriotic speeches, very similar to our celebrations today. It's likely that 4th of July celebrations in New Ulm included the recognition of the Defenders Monument, which was a monument that was erected a few years earlier by the state, honoring the defenders who aided New Ulm during the Dakota War. The 4th of July festivities were all but over now. It was early in the morning on July 5th as the city's new night watchman, 32-year-old Albert Winkelmann, patrolled the city on foot. Albert was the son of Wilhelm Winkelmann. Friends called him William. He immigrated to America from Mecklenburg, Germany at the age of 25. Albert's mother was Montana-born Carolyn Dittbenner. Albert's parents were some of the first settlers to come to this community. After completing school in New Ulm, 24-year-old Albert married 17-year-old Emily Puser, and the young couple started their family. By July of 1895, they had 2 kids. It was after midnight, early Thursday morning, July 5th. Albert was out patrolling the city. He was walking his beat. Back then, the Victorian-era clothing was still the style. Traditions from Europe and Germany still strong there. Women wore long dresses. Men would often dress in formal suits. Now, in law enforcement, they also wore a Victorian-style uniform. Albert had been issued a hat, a cane, and a revolver that he would carry in a leather pouch. Around 2 a.m., Albert was walking along the sidewalk at the corner of Mrs. Klausner's property. This was on the corner of Front and First Street in New Ulm. What Albert didn't know was that he wasn't alone on that corner. There was someone hiding in the shadows, either behind the fence or behind the light pole. As Albert walked by, that someone stepped out and when less than 2 feet away, pointed a gun at Albert's neck and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered the left side of Albert's neck, exiting on the right side of his neck. The attack happened so quickly, Albert never had a chance to shoot his revolver. He went down, dropping his cane, dropping his revolver, lost his hat, and crawled away from the scene, likely trying to get away from his unknown attacker. It was around 3 a.m. when a young girl employed at the home of Albert Kiesling woke to the sound of someone groaning outside. The sound frightened her. She closed the blinds and she went back to sleep. About an hour later, she woke to the groans again and then woke up Mr. Kiesling. When Kiesling walked outside, he also heard the sound. He saw that it was coming from a body of a man lying in the middle of the street that ran between his house and the Klausners. At first, he thought it was a drunk man until he noticed a hat and a cane several feet from the body. Then he knew something was wrong. This is when he summoned Dr. Wiesner and Dr. Fritsch, who responded shortly after 4 o'clock. Albert was described as comatose at this time and was unable to speak. He was lying on his back in a pool of blood. It appeared he had tried to get to his feet at some point, but couldn't because of his injuries. Albert Kiesling quickly recognized the watchman as his cousin, Albert Winkelmann. tried to ask Albert several questions. What happened? Did he know who shot him? But it was reported that no satisfactory answer was elicited. Albert was quickly taken to the hospital, where doctors made every effort to save his life. Early Friday morning, a day after the shooting, Albert Winkelmann died from his injuries. Coroner Rothenberg was summoned, and an inquest was held with a jury composed of John Rudolph, A.W. Bingham, Theo Kobarsch, G.A. Ottomeyer, Henry Benke, and Louis Mueller. Several witnesses were sworn in and shared testimony claiming evidence that a tramp was the murderer. Back in the late 1800s, the term tramp was used to refer to a transient, marginally employed worker who traveled from place to place, often without a home or job. That was the definition that they used back then. The term tramp originated in England and referred to tramping around. Tramps were often viewed as deviant and criminal by middle and upper class Americans. George Puser, Albert's wife's brother, had been with Albert earlier in the evening and said that they had seen a tramp in the park. George claimed he asked Albert if that was the tramp that shot him. He claimed Albert nodded yes. Dr. Weisner had also testified that Albert had indicated he was shot by a tramp. While these two were sure it was the tramp from the park, it's believed that Winkelmann never knew who shot him. But it was natural for them to suspect it was a tramp due to their reputation. That following Thursday, the New Ulm mayor offered a $200 reward for the capture of the murderer, in hopes that it would be enough incentive to encourage some active detective work. In 2024 dollars, that would be just over $7,500. On October 24th, about 4 months after Albert's murder, local citizens were surprised to learn that a well-known local veterinarian, Dr. August Cohn, had been arrested upon a warrant issued by Justice Brandt, charging him with the murder of policeman Albert Winkelmann. Albert's dad, Wilhelm Winkelmann, had done his own investigating of his son's murder. There had been a lot of rumors implicating Cohn, and he was apparently known to have been an enemy of Albert's and allegedly made threats against him, even on the night of the murder. Allegedly, the next day, Cohn pawned a revolver before leaving town with his family. Authorities apparently were watching him at the time and were tempted to arrest him, but they decided to keep him under surveillance. They later issued a warrant, and Sheriff Anderson would take the night train to Lamberton, where the veterinarian had fled, and arrested him that night for Albert's murder. After several hearings and Cohn's insistence that he was innocent, he would be tried and eventually acquitted for Albert's murder. In the end, his murder would remain officially unsolved. Albert Winkelmann was 32 years young when he was ambushed and murdered and left behind his wife and 2 children. Night watchman Albert Winkelmann was buried in the New Ulm City Cemetery. Albert had served the community for less than a year. He had grown up in New Ulm and was described as a splendid officer. Citizens said he was always obliging, conservative, and courageous. He was a homer. He was a local kid. He was born and raised here. This was his home. Heroes like Albert take on this calling because they believe in service before self. They believe in community. They want to do their part to help make sure their community is a little safer for their families, for their kids, for their neighbors, for their friends. Heroes like Albert aren't motivated by money. They're not motivated by power. They're motivated by community, by this calling to help people. Heroes like Albert are willing to run towards danger when everyone else is running away, to be willing to take risks others aren't, often to help people others won't. Albert's wife, Emily, would go on to raise their 2 children and stay in New Ulm until her death in 1938 at the age of 68. Albert was the 13th officer to die in the line of duty in Minnesota and is remembered each year in New Ulm and at the state capitol and Washington, D.C. during Police Week each May. Albert Winkelmann lived his life in this community. He dedicated his life to this community, and he gave his life serving it. Because of this, we must always make sure that his service and his sacrifice is never forgotten.
Walking eastbound, walking eastbound.
Thank you for spending the time to listen, learn about, and honor the memory of this fallen hero. Make sure you take the time to thank your local law enforcement for their service and their sacrifice. And don't forget to thank their families too. They also sacrifice so much for our safety. It's up to us to help ensure the sacrifices made by these fallen heroes and by their families are never forgotten. So please share this podcast with family and friends. Until next time, this is the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. I'm Scott Rose. Thanks for listening.